and turn this over to John and take it away.
Thanks, Dan. I want to just say thanks for everyone for attending, and feel free to make notes of your questions or go ahead and enter them into the question box, as Dan said, and we'll do our best to try to get to some of those. One of the best ways to do that as we go through the workshop today is to make a note of them as we go through the material. We're going to be covering quite a bit of material. So if you just jot those questions down or whatever, whether it's an email later or if you can get them in the question box, we'll do our best to get you an answer. We're going to be talking about resolving construction disputes in order to avoid litigation. One of the biggest challenges in our construction environment is getting early resolution of issues. The litigation business has really been growing, and so we're going to try to focus on some good tips to help you identify those issues early and get them resolved early without having to spend the effort and the money going through the litigation process. Before we do that, I'd like to find out a little bit about our audience today. What I'd like to start with, a question about your role in the construction industry. If you guys would just take a minute to check whether or not you're in an owner, contractor. That gives me an idea of the audience today. We're going to go through these questions fairly quick. So if you get a chance just to put your answer up there, we won't do too many of these. These will help us identify where we are in the process. Okay, I'm going to close this question, and just to give you an idea of our here is basically what the results came back as. We have a pretty good chunk in the consulting and architect field, and a lot of owners in the audience today. Let's do one more, or a couple more actually. Let me find out a little bit about your experience base, how much experience you have in there. I know some of you are in a conference room. If you could just kind of give an average, maybe. And we have a lot of experience in the audience. All right, there's the results for the experience in the audience, and then let's find out a little bit more about your webinar experience. We are in November, so I just kind of get an idea of how many of you have. Some of you, this is your first webinar, maybe. Some of you have been doing quite a few webinars. Well, good, good. We appreciate your time on that. Let me get through. Let's start off talking a little bit about the construction dispute resolution conflict or process. Resolution of conflicts is one of the more important aspects of the current project management environment. Over the years, over the last 40 or 50 years, two significant things have really emerged as really a source of the conflict, but also a resolution of conflicts. One major contributor to the conflicts that we see and a lack of understanding of the conflicts that we see is a basic right that the owner has to unilaterally change the contract. A construction owner, project owner has the right to do that. But at the same time, the contractor, the second thing is the contractor has the right under the impact cost theory to request an equitable adjustment. So those are the two things. Number one, it's the owner's ability to change things at will, and the contractor's inherent right to get paid for whatever those changes cost. So those are two basic theories that have been a part of the construction environment for the last few decades that is a basis for some of the conflict and resolution strategies. Of course, as we mentioned earlier, the current environment has grown more and more litigious. Since the 70s, the trend for conflict resolution and litigation has really increased, and more significantly since the 90s, with the advent of better construction documentation tools, better tracking tools, better planning tools, better analysis tools. Those technical and technology-based and just basic practices and procedures that organizations have implemented have made it easier to identify and measure impacts. And so ultimately, in order to resolve disputes, the result for a good resolution strategy requires better planning, it requires better management, better trust relationships among the project stakeholders, better documentation, and then good claims avoidance techniques. Because there are a lot of different issues that come up. I think of just your typical conflicts that typically fall under the owner's responsibility. There's late notice to proceed, access issues in a project, design delays that impact a contractor. There's delayed approvals, delayed responses to questions like RFIs, change orders, disruption, delayed payment. So often it's becoming, particularly in the economy over the last few years, that's had I've been involved in several of those types of dispute resolution. And of course the extra costs may vary. And then of course contractors also have delaying issues as well. And probably one of the most significant delay issues that contractors are responsible for is the failure to plan. In other words, the failure to put an adequate plan together to really drive the project and make sure the plan is executed. Another major delay issue is the lack of coordination that contractors have to deal with, coordinating subcontractors. You have delayed coordination, and then obviously just delayed submittals, delayed procurement. Those are the types of things that come up. So coming up with a good resolution strategy is essential. Probably the first thing that's important to really establish in an organization. If you're going to put a good strategy together for conflict resolution, it is a mindset. Early resolution is a mindset. That's one of the first things I still try to get with my clients that I work with. Get your organization in a mindset of early resolution and strategize through that, which usually requires commitment from the top down, and it generally requires a good development of procedures, and it requires training of your staff. It's not that complicated, actually. There are some really basic things. We're going to cover some very basic things today, very basic strategies for early resolution. The key is early resolution minimizes risk. That's a big topic today, this being part of our risk series. I'm involved in some risk conferences. Early resolution is the least expensive resolution. That's one of the biggest benefits that I see in early resolution strategies. It's the least expensive way to resolve an issue. If you don't resolve it early, the cost of resolving the dispute is significantly higher. Early resolution includes more options. If you identify an issue early, if you are at the table working on resolving the issues, you will always have more options for resolution as opposed to waiting till after the fact. One of the examples that I use most often, I'm involved in a lot of delay claims. One of the scenarios that I use in my presentations on delay claims is the ability to resolve it early, because you can look down the path. The earlier you resolve it, the more items on your critical path that you can manage to resolve those issues. So early resolution includes more resolution options. And then obviously it enhances partnering. Early resolution kind of feeds on itself. If your organization is committed to early resolution, you sit down with your project stakeholders and you identify an issue and you begin to resolve it early, it will develop into a pattern. And the opposite is also true. If you get into a situation where you don't resolve an issue early, that generally starts the snowplow effect, where once your early resolution falls behind, nearly resolving anything becomes difficult. Step 1, planning and documentation. This is one of the most important parts of coming up with a good conflict resolution strategy. Now, good planning is essential for various things. One, identifying issues in a timely manner, right? If you don't have a good plan in place, if you don't have a good budget, if you're not tracking your budget, you won't know when you're running over budget or when the issues are. You know, if you don't have a good project plan, a good schedule in place, if a contractor doesn't have a good schedule in place, it's difficult to know what's going on, what delays are occurring if you don't have a plan to measure against. This is one of the reasons why it's important as an owner. Most of you in the crowd today are owners or architects. That's why it's so important to get a contractor schedule in place as early as possible on the project. Instead of going back and forth on whether or not you should approve it or not, at least get a project plan on record so that you can begin measuring progress and identifying those issues. The second thing is documentation, which includes timely notification. That's essential in getting issues resolved. Notification's a big one. You know, if you're a contractor, if you don't have this in your contract, you should get it in there. And most of the contracts in the projects that I see have notification clauses. But it's important for you to really stress this in your risk management program. When you're starting a project, get the stakeholders together, and notification should be one of the topics at the top of your list. Because as an owner, it allows you to analyze the scope of the problem right away. If a contractor doesn't notify you or they're not formally notifying you, then it makes it a little less difficult to really identify, well, what is the scope of this issue? Notification also allows you to make adjustments to address the issue early. Once again, the earlier you identify, the more options you have for making those types of adjustments. As an owner, it allows you, a good notification scheme allows you to control the cost of the issue, right? It gives you more options so you can manage what the delay or what the change is going to cost and how it's going to be managed. You know, it allows you to maintain and manage your own documentation. You know, when an issue comes up, that's one of the main things that happens is a contractor begins documenting the extra cost, extra time, so forth. If there's no notification in place, then an owner has less likelihood that their documentation will be as good as it could be. So, and then lastly, you know, notification allows you to resolve the issue while it's still fresh. Resolution is always better. It's always easier to resolve something when it's fresh on the minds of all the project stakeholders. And then, of course, that's from a contractor standpoint. Making sure that the contractor is providing timely notification is so important. And then from an owner standpoint, it's important. But timely documentation is another one. Timely notification and timely documentation. In other words, getting the documentation in place in contemporaneous schedules, right? Timely responses. That's important for you as owners to get timely responses. Just because you have a clause in your contract that says you have 14 days to respond to an RFI does not mean that you shouldn't respond to that RFI much earlier. If you have the opportunity to respond early, respond early. In fact, here's a good point. If you have an RFI form, one of the basic things that you should put on an RFI form is a contractor, when he fills out an RFI form, needs to look at his schedule and document on that RFI form when or how much float that particular activity that the RFI is impacting, how much float it has. Something like that is very simple. It takes just a few minutes on a contractor's side to do that, but it gives you the ability as an owner to know how critical that RFI is and helps the architect determine which RFIs need to be responded to. You can do the same thing with submittals. Which submittals do we need to be returning as in the most timely manner? Timely responses are one of the most they're one of the most common causes of delay. It results in delays. A lot of times it results in constructive changes. If a response to a submittal doesn't come back in time, the constructive acceleration is a big factor. In other words, when you are constructively accelerating a contractor as an owner, is when you're not granting a time extension that the contractor is due, and you're still threatening liquidated damages, so the contractor is accelerating. A lot of times that comes back on the owner to pay the acceleration cost under constructive acceleration. But it's due to a lack of timely responses. So having that's one of those mindsets that you need to develop as an organization. Plan, get the plan in place, and document. Your documentation includes notification, documentation, and timely responses. Timely notification, timely documentation, timely responses. Some basic things you can do is prepare quality specifications. Specifications have, you have the technical specifications, but when it comes to documentation, when it comes to RFIs and submittals, how they're managed, all the administrative components of the specifications have evolved over the years, as well as scheduling specifications. And the biggest issue that has driven these changes has been the legal requirements. It's huge. In fact, that is the number one reason that contractors or owners spend extra time, extra money putting the specifications together. So it's important that you get a good specification section together to help you deal with early resolution of issues. And in some of our other webinars, we've given you some good tips. You're welcome to go on and look at those, whether it's scheduling, whether it's documentation, some good scheduling specifications that really help drive early resolution, which is the key. But the key is, no matter how large the specification is, you can't guarantee, there's no guarantee out there that every issue is going to get resolved early. You can't guarantee that schedules are going to be any good. You can't guarantee any of that with the schedule. So it takes more than just a good contract specification. Step number two, understand the risk. Understand your project risk. And I've used this table. In fact, I did a presentation earlier this week and pulled this table out. This is just a list of project risk that are common on just about any kind of project, or there certainly are the potential for risk. And so understanding those up front, this is a good exercise to take an organization through, a good exercise to take your crew or your project team through at the beginning of the job. Just walk down through this list, take just a minute to discuss each one of these items, and then look at who is responsible. Make an assessment of who is responsible for these different items. There's outside influences, right? There's resources and prerequisites to projects. There's performance-related elements. Some of them we've already talked about. But understanding those, and what's important, if you're an owner, you have the ability to drive these types of meetings. You have the ability in your pre-construction meeting to call it even a special meeting, just to sit down and have a risk management meeting and talk about some things like the schedule or whatever. And this table is a very good example of just an exercise you can go through and identify issues on your project that are potential risk, where your potential conflicts are going to be. If you want to resolve them early, this is one of the best ways to understand how you can identify those issues early. It's amazing when I've gone through this exercise with project groups, how many of these different areas, there's a question, well, who is responsible if that happens? Well, identifying that early in the process can save you a lot of grief later on. You can still disagree, and the issue may not come up, but if it does, at least you know right away, hey, this is an area where we've already understand that we disagree, so let's manage it accordingly. Some of the new things that are risk now is the technology available. But knowing the areas where conflict is likely to arise, carefully planning to address these can reduce the risk of conflict and therefore increase the chance of a successful project and early resolution of disputes. So early identification and a good, healthy debate will help you understand those risks early on. Here's another type of risk. We're talking specifically about resolving disputes, resolving conflicts early. One of the most common things that I come across in issues, I look at a lot of issues that I think, wow, that could have been resolved so much earlier. One of the main reasons that a lot of issues don't get resolved early is just the lack of understanding, or the lack of a somewhat of a step back look, of what the conflict is about, what the potential risks are in a conflict. So I have an exercise that I typically go through where I will walk through it with a client, walk through it with a project group, once again, in a third-party type of role, to look at the risk for dispute resolution. And one of the first questions is, how big is this dispute? How big is this claim? How much is this claim worth? And obviously, an owner looks at it differently than a contractor. A contractor is putting a claim together. They have a value in mind of how much the claim is worth. And a lot of times, it's not worth exactly what they think it is, right? Because there's different variables. You have extra work. You have extra work that may be part of a claim that's very well documented. It's very well, it's easily identified as extra work. You have another section of the claim that may be a loss of productivity claim. Well, loss of productivity claims are a lot more difficult to, not only difficult to substantiate, but difficult to support from a cause standpoint. What actually caused the loss of productivity? And so, and then you also have the delay issues. How much is this delay worth? What was, how is that? We'll talk about that in a minute. But one of the first exercises that you want to do is step back from the claim, whether you're the contractor or the owner, and try to identify. One of the reasons I break these out in these categories is to identify what I call black, white, and gray areas. There are some, and just a lot of times it's opinion, but there are a lot of claims where you can take it and say, here is a section of this claim. Here is a portion of this claim that is pretty clear, pretty black and white. The only issue may be, entitlement, or it may be cost, whatever the issue might be, and you can set a determinate amount on it by saying, this is probably 80% we can substantiate pretty thoroughly, right? Loss of productivity. You may look at it and say, well, this is really gray because the contractor had issues, but the owner also did have issues. What's the value of that? You may say, well, let's, at the most, it's 50% because it's a shared issue. Same thing with delay. One of the best exercises is to take a claim and break it out and try to identify the black, white, and then the gray areas, because that's going to really help you start to determine exactly what your claim is worth. That's one of the first steps you want to do. Here's a good example of a delay issue that sometimes it's black, sometimes it's white, and sometimes it's really gray. I've given an example here of a early completion delay claim, right? In a lot of cases, you have a contract date right here, and the contractor is saying they should have finished back here. In actuality, they finished out here. Well, you have two time periods that you're looking at. Depending on the contract clauses, sometimes there's a clause that says no overhead is allowed prior to the contract allotted time, no additional overhead. Sometimes it's hard for a contractor to substantiate an early completion schedule. But there's basically two sets of periods. So just because you have a delay claim, you need to identify how much of it is an early completion schedule or early completion impacts, how much of it is after the contract date. Because both of those get resolved in a different, there's a different percentage that you're going to be putting on both of those. If it is an early completion schedule, one of the first things that a contractor is going to have to substantiate is that they intended to complete the project early. And so as a contractor, if you plan on completing early, you better be documenting that you plan on completing early. Second thing a contractor has to support is that they had the capability of completing early. And one of the best ways to show that as a contractor is that you would have completed, that you were ahead of schedule, or you were meeting your early completion schedule dates prior to the delay. And then the third thing, the contractor has to show that they would have completed early but for these delays and not for delays on their own. So early completion delay claims have to be analyzed as part of that risk assessment for conflict resolution, understanding those dates. Here's a good example of how all this, or here are some other issues that you have to consider in resolving the disputes. Legal fees, consulting fees, staff allocations. It's amazing how many contractors and owners spend a lot of staff time working on putting a claim together, and sometimes I've sat down with them after the fact and said, you know, you probably would have been better off going after another job and using the effort in that direction and making your money back that way. There's managerial factors. There's the loss of focus. There's client goodwill. All of these are factors that go into it. So I've got an example here of how you might just do a risk analysis. Here's from a contractor's perspective. You want to take this is a real simple exercise, but every claim, every dispute, it doesn't really even matter how small it is. It needs to kind of work through this process, because this is what you're going to use to analyze how much effort you're going to put into it, you know, how much it's going to take, and if it's really worth it. You know, one extreme is if you've got a change order for $200, you'll probably spend more than $200 trying to collect it. So sometimes it's just better not to even mess with something. So in that case, you know, that's basically you've done a risk analysis. Okay, so no matter how small, no matter how big, you do a risk analysis to determine. So here's, if it's a sizable claim, this is the kind of exercise that you want to look at. You look at your extra work. Let's say you have extra work that you thought was $400,000. But when you really look at it, you think, okay, we probably could only get 75% of that because of our documentation, or maybe there's some entitlement issues or whatever. Then you take a delay. You say, okay, out of that delay, a portion of that is an early completion. That's has a low percentage of collection, and then our delay documentation is not that good. So let's put 100,000 at that. 33%. Loss of productivity. We've got a good documentation for that. We've got a good measured mile, but there's some entitlement issues. Here's the black, white, and gray. Let's put down half of that. So what started out as a $1 million claim, you're actually down now to $550,000 if you were to go to maybe some type of mediation or some kind of third-party dispute resolution. Now, if you've got a $550,000 claim, now that you've actually put your likely percentage of collection down, it's going to take you $150,000 to put it together with your legal fees and consulting fees, whatever. Then you have your managerial factor. Maybe it's a good client that you've worked with before, and you think, you know what, if I fight them on this, it may cost me a little more on another job, or I may not get that next job. What are some of the factors that this may cost me? And so you ultimately, you look at this, and here's the net value of your claim, $100,000. Well, you look at it, you say, well, I could make, by doing, let's say if you're making 10%, by doing another $1 million of work, I could make that $100,000. I'd rather take all of my effort that we're going to put into this and just go get $1 million worth of work and do what I do best as a contractor. Sometimes that's the best decision. But if you do this exercise, and you go through the numbers and you look at it and say it's a $1 million claim or a $2 million claim, and it's worth going after, what you have to do is treat it as a project, just like you would any one of your other projects. Put your budget together, put your time frames together, and manage through that process. Put your management team together and get it done. Here's the same scenario from an owner standpoint. I have a lot of owners, that I work with. They start off at zero usually, but you maybe you look at it and say, you know what, we think that extra work is only worth $100,000, but they could get $300,000. Maybe it's just a scenario where you're looking at, hey, this is potentially going to mediation, right? And a mediator, let's just assume a mediator is going to try to get you halfway. So you look at it and you say, hey, we think it's only 100, they're at 600, but let's just assume they could get half of it. The delay, we look at it and say, hey, they're asking for 300. We think they could probably get 100, and you kind of work at it the same thing. You look at the loss of productivity and say, well, we did have some issues. It's hard to quantify. We don't know how much it is. The contractor's saying it's 300,000, but it might be 150. Let's look at that. And you go through the same exercise. You say, hey, here is the cost that what we think, even if we think we have a good argument. Most disputes come about because both sides think they have good arguments. So if you look at it and you say, we think we have a good argument, but we might end up getting stuck with this, and doing a valid assessment is very important. And then once again, you look at what it's going to cost you to put it together, and ultimately this claim could cost you $900,000. The contractor asked that same claim. The contractor was asking for $1 million. Contractor thinks he's got $1 million. If it ends up like this, he only gets $100,000 out of the deal. The owner is saying it's zero, but if he fights it and the contractor comes out with half, you ended up giving him $900,000. You'd have been better off probably, just settling it much earlier. So doing a risk analysis and understanding your dispute is one of the primary steps in getting it resolved early. Because it's amazing, if you notice, usually this group right here in the middle is the only group that comes out of that scenario, or the preparation cost is coming out of that pretty good. Step number 3, select the right resolution method. And there's a lot of ones. We're going to talk, this section I'm going to talk just quickly about, I'm going to use the example of delay resolution. Over the last 20 years, nearly every claim has included the delay, and a lot of times the delay itself is what's holding up resolution. So we're going to talk about selecting the right resolution method. But that theory is important no matter what the type of conflict. Select the right resolution method. First, know your options. What kind of conflict is this? And here is where most organizations miss early resolution, because they don't really understand what the issue is. So understanding what the options are for resolution requires you to understand what the issues are. Was this, in a delay example, was this a pure delay or was it a disruption delay? In other words, a pure delay is a delay where you basically, the work on the critical path was stopped, and it's easy to measure when the critical path, the delay to the critical path started and when it stopped, or what was the impact of inserting this fragnet or inserting this activity into the critical path. That's what you call a pure delay. It's measurable. You can look at it. You can see what the extended general conditions are going to be, and that's usually the cost associated with it. The other type of delay, the resolution or conflict issue, is disruption. Totally different type of delay. That's where it's not possible to sit down and actually plug an activity in. It's where so many things were going on that the work was disrupted. The most, a common example is you go out on a project, and let's say it's a highway project, and the contractor's, building the job, and you run into unsuitable materials or soft spots in the soil. You have design issues that start popping up, and the flow of the work becomes disrupted. So there's primarily the result is loss of productivity. But it's not necessarily a delay that you can plug right into a schedule and show the impacts. So understanding those two, it's interesting. I come across contracts where the contract specifications for resolving it require an analysis that's really just addressing a pure delay. They require a contemporaneous type of analysis, what they call a contemporaneous analysis. Well, a contemporaneous analysis may not be the type of analysis you would use for a disruption claim. So understanding those issues will help. Here's 4 types of analysis, by the way. The first one is a total time analysis, and this is the same as a total cost analysis. And this is the most common type of analysis if it is some type of disruption claim. In other words, you're saying, we were going to do this work in this time right here, but it actually took this amount of time. And it's because of this disruptive nature of the work, whether it was excessive change orders. Sometimes they'll call that death by 1,000 cuts, where just so many changes over and over and over again, a contractor can't get their work performed in a productive way. So there's no particular delay. Here's the difference, and whether it's total time or total cost, it's the same scenario. So there's ways to address this type of claim. One, you have to show there's no other way to quantify it. So a lot of times a contractor will turn in a total cost or total time claim when really you can identify it. It was a particular issue that you could do. So the only time you can use this is if there's no other way to do it. The contractor has to show that the original duration is reasonable. One of the strongest ways to defend against this is demonstrating that they couldn't have met this original duration anyway. The second one is the actual duration is reasonable. Did the contractor actually sit on the job and work? Or was he sending people over to other jobs? What was going on? And then the contractor has to demonstrate that the difference in this was not my fault. Most of those, that's one of the hardest ones to address because contractors have production problems as well, and trying to cipher through those how much of this delay or how much of this total cost was the contractor's responsibility, how much of it was the owner's responsibility. Another one, adjusted as planned schedule approach. This is not used that much anymore, but occasionally it is. This is where maybe you don't have consistent updates in the project, so you take the original plan, you insert a delay into that original plan, and you measure the impact. This is for a pure delay. These are pure delay type of analysis. There's the adjusted as-built schedule approach. This is where you take an as-built schedule, you build it all the way through from start to finish of the job, you identify the delays in the as-built schedule, and then you take those delays out and they collapse it back. It's a collapsed schedule or adjusted as-built but for attorneys like this because it's based on fact. The weakness with this schedule, with the adjusted as-planned schedule, the weakness of this type of analysis is that it doesn't have any kind of as-built data. We really don't know if this impacted activity out here after the fact was really on the critical path by the time this delay occurred. In a lot of cases it wasn't. Maybe there were submittals that came in late where that activity couldn't have happened. The advantage of this is at least it has an objective critical path, a critical path developed prior to the delay itself. In the adjusted as-built, the advantage is you have good, accurate as-built information, but the weakness is there's no objective critical path analysis available because it's all after the fact. Everything is subjective at this point. What really was the driving logic in my schedule? So those two schedule analysis are the opposite. Here's another weakness with the adjusted as-built schedule. Even though you have factual data, it's hard to know what was the critical path. Here's a typical critical path impact. Let's say you have an underground electrician who's delayed, and the plumber is also performing his work at the same time. There's a delay with the electrical contractor here for a few days pushing the slab out. So the plumber, knowing that the slab has been delayed, sends his equipment over to another job and starts letting his activity slide. And sure enough, he comes back, his equipment breaks down, and he ends up impacting that slab an additional day. Well, if you look at that after the fact, it might look like that plumber was really on the critical path, when in reality, it was the electrician delay. The plumber was just managing their float. So understanding that's one of the challenges with the adjusted as-built. And then the most commonly specified type of analysis, which is the best, but the easiest and the most supportable analysis, is the contemporaneous time frame analysis. And once again, there are several different types of analysis you can do, but these are just the basic categories. Some type of contemporaneous. That means you have a critical path that has as-built schedule up to and prior to the delay, so that you can objectively say, yes, here is my critical path prior to the delay. It's the most objective analysis that you can do. And a lot of times it's a matter of taking data that or delay activity that occurred during that period and plugging it into that schedule, into that contemporaneous schedule, and doing an analysis. Once again, there's several forms or several formats for doing this, some that are better than others, but ideally the contemporaneous time frame analysis is the best. So once again, the number 3 step is really identifying what kind of issue it is and what the best strategy is for resolving it. If it's a total cost type of claim, understanding what it is, its disruption, what's the best way to analyze it? One of the best ways to analyze it is maybe have a measured mile. See if there is some type of portion of the project where there was consistent productivity that you can use to manage what the productivity should have been compared to what had actually happened. Understanding what the issue is, identifying it, and then coming up with a proper resolution. And then step 4 is prepare your presentation to convince and not to conflict. Most presentations that I get involved with have been prepared to conflict, to really agitate, in a lot of cases, to almost not helping the resolution process. So the idea is to present to convince. Make sure that your presentation, or make sure that your analysis has been thorough. Take the time to do that. And then keep it simple. I use the example in all my training. I use the example of my kids when they were young. It was amazing. I could sit and read them a storybook, and as long as it had good pictures, they could see exactly what's going on in the story. They didn't have to read. All they needed was a good picture. So I use that same, that same analogy when I'm working with people to get a good presentation. Keep it simple. Get good graphs, good, simple, thorough explanations for what's going on. And then ultimately, to resolve it, an organization has to be flexible. Has to be flexible. So in order to be thorough, once again, you need to understand some of the issues associated with it. Keeping it simple, you definitely need to understand issues and then being flexible. What are the different ways to resolve it? This is one of the biggest areas that I see why issues don't get resolved, is the sides don't understand the issues well enough to give them the flexibility that they need to resolve it. Here's a good example. Just understanding the difference between excusable delays. What is an excusable delay? Well, a delay means I can give a time extension to a contractor without actually paying for overhead, right? That's an excusable delay. And not all delays require compensable remuneration. An all excusable delay means an owner can't charge liquidated damages. That's the big key there. The other side of that is the compensable. Understanding compensable versus non-compensable delays. So compensable delays basically means that the owner is going to pay the contractor for the additional overhead caused by a delay. So once again, just understanding those two terms, those two concepts would help a lot of issues get resolved. Here's an example, and this is an example of how delay issues I come across typically don't get resolved. Here's an example. I've got a door that, as a contractor, I ordered my door late, so here is when I was supposed to finish the job, but my door showed up late. And so I didn't get my doors on there 5 days. Now, this is a simple example, right? So actually, as a contractor, I delayed the project 5 days. Now, the owner came in and made some electrical changes and delayed the project 10 days. The question is, how would you resolve that, right? How many days are excusable? How many days would are compensable. How many days can the contractor be charged LDs? In this case, probably 0, right? But at the same time, how many days can the contractor charge for extra overhead? Well, he was going to be out here these 5 days anyway because of his own delay, so the only amount of days he could charge would be 5, right? Non-compensable, 5. How many days are non-excusable? 10. So the resolution of this, it's a 10-day delay. So as an owner, you could give a contract time extension for 10 days, right? That would mean it's excusable, but only 5 days compensable, 5 days non-compensable. And a lot of situations would be resolved if you had that flexibility and you understood the issue well enough to say, hey, here's the potential resolution. Being flexible. Here's the other side. You switch it around. Just understanding once again, the contractor delayed the project 10 days because the door didn't show up. The electrical finishes delayed, the change that the owner made, delayed it 5 days. You ask the same question. You know, how many days are excusable? Well, the key there is how many days can the owner charge the contractor liquidated damages? In this case, it's 5 days. How many days are non-excusable? 5. How many days are compensable? How many days can the contractor charge for compensation for general conditions? 0. How many days are non-compensable? 10. In other words, the contractor can't charge the owner for, even though the owner delayed the project 5 days, because the contractor also delayed himself, he can't charge the owner for his extra overhead. But at the same time, the owner can't charge the contractor for that amount of liquidated damages because the owner caused the delay. So the potential resolution here is a 5-day non-compensable time extension. You're not going to charge the contractor 5 days of liquidated damages. Understanding those, instead of just trying to lump all 10 days in the same category, simple review of those kind of things will be helpful in resolving issues. And then obviously, ultimately, with the schedule type of analysis, understanding the float is probably one of the hottest topics that I get involved with now. Early completion schedules, when a project is scheduled to complete prior to the contract allotted time, that's one type of float, right? But there's another type of float that individual activities have, right? So a lot of times a specification may come up dealing with early completion schedule that says if the contractor shows the project finishing early, it becomes float, or all the float belongs to the owner, or the float belongs to the project. All of those different float management clauses deal with these different issues with float. Early completion schedules, how are you going to manage that? Understanding that up front. Ideally, those type of early completion schedules start off as a conflict. But in reality, nearly every owner I know and nearly every contractor I know would like to finish early. So developing a strategy early on. What are we going to do with completion schedules? We don't want to discourage early completion, so how can we manage those early completions? Developing that strategy. Looking at individual activities, understanding the difference between early completion float and individual activity floats. I've seen a contract that said all float belongs to the owner. They're actually addressing the early completion schedule, but an attorney later on applied it to an individual activity, and so basically any float management issue became a concurrent delay. And then lastly, understanding the concurrent delay. Basically, 2 more delays are impacting the project during the same period considered. And what we looked at in this previous slide is a perfect example, or a very simple example, of concurrent delay. Understanding concurrent delay and resolving concurrent delay, how much of it was actually concurrent, and what the ultimate responsibility was for each one of the delays. Actually, true concurrent delays are pretty rare, but the difference is whether a project was, or an activity was delayed through float management, or whether it was delayed without consideration of float. That really is what helps determine concurrent delay. So the last thing that we talked about here was understanding the issues and coming up with good resolution options, seeking a good resolution strategy early on. I do have just a couple minutes here before the let me see if we have any questions. I'll take a couple of questions. Let me pull my question panel up. I do have a question. Are copies of the slides going to be sent out? And we will send a copy of the slides. Those will be available. In fact, I think there's a survey after the webinar. If you'll complete your survey, you will have an option to select whether or not you want the slides and a certificate. There's another question regarding contract specifications on early completion schedules. Do you want to have an early completion schedule contract clause? There's a lot of different ways those are addressed. Sometimes it's addressed by changing the contract. Sometimes an early completion clause addresses that early completion issue by rejecting a schedule if it shows an early completion schedule. It's a very controversial topic, but it is good to address it in the contract. At least it gets the discussion going early in the process. If you have an issue like that or a concern, or if you want some suggestions on contracts dealing with early completion schedules, be sure and let me know. Once again, thank you for attending today. We hope you got some good information out of it. We'd appreciate any kind of feedback that you can we can help you out. I appreciate it. Thank you.